Welcome to my presentation on the criminal justice system's response to sexual assault. So I chose this topic because sexual assault is one of the most underreported crimes, and there are theories as to why that is, but most of these theories focus on victim response rather than how the criminal justice system responds to the issue, and I wanted to evaluate that aspect of it as far as is the way that they respond a positive or a negative manner? Are the procedures involved too fast or too slow? What are the policies in place to help these victims? I wanted to find out things like that. So to begin with, I've got some key terms. There's survivor satisfaction, which is how victims felt they were treated by response personnel, detectives, prosecution, things like that. There are community-based providers and then non-community-based providers. Community-based providers are resources such as counselors, victim advocates, medical and mental health professionals, things like that found in the immediate vicinity of the victim, and then non-community-based providers would be people found outside of this group. Informal social support are support systems such as family, friends, spiritual leaders, and other non-professionals close to the victim. Then there's decision making, which is how law enforcement and prosecutors choose to move forward with victims' reports and cases. And there are extra legal factors, which are factors outside of the law, such as victim credibility, for example, that influence the decision making process. There are two main issues in my research, and that is decision making and the reporting stage and victim response personnel interactions. So when it comes to decision making, there are three people who decide what's the best way for a victim's case to move forward, and that would be the victim, the officer, and prosecution. Conflicts between these individuals often arise, and this can lead to a lack of the case moving forward. A skew in power is usually what stops these cases from moving forward, as far as the officer feeling that they have more control over the situation than the victim, or pressuring the victim into this, that, and the other. In the reporting stage and victim response personnel interactions, sometimes professionalism isn't always maintained, and an officer's biases or opinions might influence their decision making. This can cause them to put pressure on and make accusations and judgments on the sexual assault victim. And then there are examples down here as to ways that they might do such. Sorry, moving on for time purposes. There are some debates within the literature. So the first paragraph and the third paragraph actually agree with each other, and I put the middle paragraph in there to indicate where the debate would come in. So the first paragraph talks about how officers are often influenced by rape myths and stereotypes when they interact with sexual assault victims. Obviously, this is not good for the victims if an officer is coming in there with their own personal judgment. And in addition to that, a lot of changes that might have been made to the criminal justice system in the response of handling sexual assaults have been claimed to be symbolic changes rather than actual improvements in the system. However, this one source states that contrary to the majority of the research, which is the research that I found, officers are very critical of the response that they have towards sexual assault victims. Unfortunately, it seems like this source is the one of very few that feels that way, because another source, Lonsway and Archambault, find that statistics drastically dispute officers' claims about improvements within their system. So even though there might be a very small minority of officers that feel as if things are going well within their system and how they respond to victims, facts and statistics are not supporting that. There are three theories that I focused on. The first being legal formalism. Legal formalism predicts the statutory elements of a crime that are primary determinants of the official decision-making in processing sexual assaults. So basically, this is saying that those involved in the decision-making processes only focus on factual elements about the report. The theory is claiming that only legal matters are relevant to an officer or prosecutor. The second theory is schema theory. Schema refers to the cognitive framework that helps organize and interpret information. Officers, with the situations that they deal with, have to rapidly assess and gather information about a situation in order to come to a quick decision on how to proceed with that situation. This theory attempts to explain how/why officers come to the decisions that they make, especially with regards to a sexual assault report. And last but not least is the focal concerns theory. Focal concerns are an area of focus. Specific to this theory, the focal concerns that officers and prosecutors pay attention to when making a sentencing decision are the blameworthiness of the offender, the desire to protect the community, and the concerns about social costs, constraints, and/or consequences of their decisions. So essentially, this theory and the ones before all attempt to explain decision-making, but they each analyze a different aspect of the decisions that come into play when making that choice. I focused also on 3 different types of methodologies, the first being a survey. Surveys often consist of a series of multiple choice and/or short answer questions that participants answer in order to determine their views and opinions on a certain subject matter. Surveys typically open with a demographic section before they ask questions regarding their specific focus. Strengths of surveys can include firsthand data sources, you're getting this information directly from that source. But they are limited in the way that they can only pose certain scenarios and choices to the participants. They're also limited in the way that their participant pool might not be that representative of the research with which they're talking about. The data sources that were involved with this methodology in my research were law enforcement officers and sexual assault victims, and the surveys typically asked about how they viewed their interactions with one another. The second methodology that I found in my research was interviews. Interviews consist of a series of back and forth interactions between an interviewer, someone who asks questions, and an interviewee, someone who answers the questions. While interviews typically involve 2 people, the number of interviewees can vary. Strengths with this source, again as the last source, are that the data is coming firsthand from that person, that source, but the weakness lies in the fact that it only relies on information that is formally reported, which excludes a number of victims and officers from the research. And this data source involved law enforcement officers and sexual assault victims, and they were being asked to evaluate the decision-making process on either of their ends. Last but not least, the third methodology I found was secondary analysis. Secondary analysis is data/information gathered from other sources, which means that all of the information being analyzed is not from one's own research. A strength of this methodology is that you have the ability to find a multitude of information and sources since it's not your own firsthand research, but that is limited and weakened by the way in which those sources can often be outdated. For instance, Cursor at the bottom of this slide is from 1990, which is almost over 30 years ago, actually. The data sources involved with secondary analysis typically came from arrest records and sexual assault reports, and then you can see where these records and reports came from. In conclusion, with methodology, the biggest downside to these methods is that each of the researchers only analyzed one of the parties involved with the issue. When I say one, I mean there are victims and then there's the criminal justice system. If there was a survey done by XYZ researchers, they might have only focused on victims, and then if there was an interview done by researcher A, they might have only focused on the criminal justice advocates in that area. You can't have research only coming from one part of a 2-part system. So that information being not included can skew the research. It can misinterpret the analysis and the research that's found, and that's really how all these methodologies are hindered. To wrap up, I have 2 ethics scenarios. I am going to tell you to pause the video and read the scenario, and then I'll go into an explanation after that, and I just say that for time's purposes. But yeah, if you want to pause the video now and then read the scenario. So if you read the scenario, basically this officer is stuck between choosing to not let their personal feelings or prejudices influence their decision, because they need to make no compromises for crime. So are they going to go with how they feel about this woman having been brought into their precinct multiple times? Are they going to go with their views on what their team is saying about this woman? Or are they going to listen to this woman and say, oh, yeah, she may have done XYZ, but this is a crime and we treat all crimes equally? Again, if you'd please pause the video so that you can read this ethics scenario too, and then I'll explain to you what the dilemma is with this individual. So if you read the scenario, basically this is talking about how prosecutors need to listen to their elders. They need to know that there are others who are familiar with and more experienced and specialized with certain parts of law enforcement. However, they also need to have their own independent judgment when interacting with law enforcement and others. So it's just kind of the choice of, hey, do I go with my instinct here? Can I disregard what this person is saying? Or do I need to listen to what this person is saying? That's the ethical scenario here. But last but not least, in conclusion, there's little to no way to improve the criminal justice system response to an interaction with victims of sexual assault if there is no research regarding how these things are being gone about, which is what I wanted to look at. I wanted to look at what are these interactions, not just how they result, like what the results are. Change is possible, but the system has to want the changes just as much as the people want the changes. So it can't just be victims and advocates wanting the system to change without the system actually changing. Change cannot come with only one group willing to demand change, and this has been the case so far. The world does not want or need any more thwarted sexual assault cases because the people entrusted with those responsibilities are either careless, biased, or ruthless, which is why it is important to identify these areas of impact now in order to make a beneficial change for the future. And I will quickly go through my references. Thank you for watching my presentation.